Because we're in this environment, we're used to John Roll and Johnson and, and Wells and those kinds of names. But I'm really pleased to have him share with us today. I met him about a year or two ago when his university came to support us at the 19th World Conference of Banking and Finance Institute in 2011. And so we gained a good friendship with the university, and we are partnering with them to offer bachelor's degrees to the students of the institute who would wish to move on. So it's my pleasure to have him, and I'm going to just do a brief introduction, and he'll tell you a little bit more about himself if he wishes. I'll give him that opportunity. But Dr. Sadjadi, am I pronouncing it right? Sadjadi. Oh, I'm getting it. With a little practice, I'll get it. Dr. Sadjadi is a professor of economics and chairman of the Department of Economics and Finance at Winston-Salem State University in North Carolina. He is the former chief economist of the city and county of San Francisco and a former chief labor economist of the state of California. He has also written a number of books, two in fact that he gave me, The Modern State Intervention in the Era of Globalization, and he authored another book called The Economics of Common and Civil Law. He has written a number of articles as well with one of the local professors who were here with us at the College of the Bahamas, Dr. Nick Carolus, who I had the opportunity to sit in his class at Nova Southeastern University. So it is really my pleasure to present to you today Dr. Zaros Sadjadi. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing it right.
Thank you very much. It's fine. I always tell people in my class, I don't really worry too much about how they call me. Just so long as they hand in their work and they do everything on time. And the same thing pretty much applies when I'm dealing with anyone else. I'm not terribly worried about people butchering my name because God knows I probably have butchered a few in my lifetime as well. I wanted to talk briefly about some of the international experiences with value-added tax and discuss the government's particular implementation, which is known as the destination principle, against another principle that can be used called the origin-based principle. Most of my knowledge and experience of that comes from Canada. I was the president of the Southern Association for Canadian Studies. I was a scholar in Canada for a couple of years. My doctoral dissertation, in fact, is on the impact of globalization on Canada's provinces. The value-added tax is a much more efficient mechanism for collection of revenue, as was explained by Mr. Roll, for the government, but it also has a number of benefits to both businesses and consumers. The primary benefit to businesses has to do with the adjunct of needing to put in good accounting systems, as Mr. Roll suggested as well. The fact that a business understands what is actually happening with the money that's coming in and the money going out can have an immediate impact in terms of the ability of that business to be fiscally prosperous. At the same time, it does provide benefits for consumers when it is replacing existing tax systems. And I think that the classic problem that most people have is they say, but I'm going to be taxed 15%. And I wasn't taxed before. But of course you are. You're taxed immensely through customs duties. I was actually very surprised when I hear that the Bahamas is collecting 17% of its revenues already, because the United States traditionally has only collected between 18 and 21% of its GDP. And it has customs duties, although very low. It has income tax. It has, although not a national sales tax, it has sales taxes, of course, collected by different states. It has a much more robust taxing regime than does the Bahamas, which is very narrowly focused on goods. By expanding the range of items to services, then obviously the amount spent on the goods can come down. A couple of things came to mind as I was listening. And one of the questions deals with this notion of when is a good time to implement. The fact of the matter is that it's probably better to implement a change in tax policy during an economic downturn than during an expansion, because it is harder for businesses to raise prices when you have everybody hurting. But I should point out that most countries around the world, when they have gone to a type of value-added tax or other type of system, have also looked at the equity considerations that have been so eloquently put forward by the questioners. Thus, in Canada, what happens is that every household actually gets a GST credit, the goods and services tax, being basically a value-added tax in Canada. And so you would get a check from the government that is supposed to offset the fact that you have certain basic foodstuffs, you have certain basic needs that you have to meet. And they then happen to impose the value-added tax on a broader range. In this manner, what happens is you can say everybody is made whole up to what you would call a poverty line, and then people who are wealthier are actually then net payers of the tax, and then the incidence does not fall on the poor. And I would urge at least some thought to this process about trying to cushion the poor, as opposed to trying to look at certain basic foodstuffs and trying to lower or change duty on these bases. The question as well was raised up with rents. And so the problem, of course, with rent or any other thing, you've got to decide, is it going to be zero rated or is it going to be exempt? If it's exempt, then the inputs can come back, but I would probably suspect that it will be actually considered to be a zero-rated entity, which means that, in fact, the problem is you may not be charged directly the value-added tax, but you will be charged indirectly on all these small businesses. And that comes to another concern of mine based upon the talk about implementation. By exempting the firms, or actually by exempting the firms, as opposed to zero rating firms that are small, what you're effectively doing is you're making them pay the tax. It will then be passed on to the consumers, and you will not see it. The wonderful thing about the value-added tax, in one sense, is it is in your face. You see an objective amount that you are spending on government each time. It makes the public realize that they have a stake in the fiscal health of the government. And it also means that they will demand accountability. What you need to do is you need to foster that, I think, in other ways as well. And the way that I would suggest going about doing that is to turn this around and look at what's called the origin principle instead of the destination principle. The problem in the Bahamas is that about 60% of your economy is driven by tourism. And tourism is technically an export. So if we are truly using the destination principle, we should be exempting most, if not all, of the tourism sector. But you can't do that. It's too large of a sector. It would cause immense dislocations. Instead, what I would recommend is turning this around and exempting the imports and instead taxing the exports, since you're doing it already. This has some direct benefits. For somebody coming back from Florida, if we were to impose the origin principle, they would not have to worry about paying the VAT. You can imagine the long lines that you're going to have trying to pay all of these taxes at the border when you're coming back from Florida. You can also imagine the costs that are going to be imposed and the various mechanisms that you'll have to have in place to determine exactly how much of that you're going to be dealing with, whether you're going to go around zero rating basic foodstuffs or you're going to charge it. Now, of course, I can hear some people say, but wait a minute, isn't that going to disadvantage our tourism sector? The fact of the matter is that if you go to the United States, you go to Europe, many of these countries already are imposing accommodation taxes in the 10 to 15% range. There is going to be no competitive disadvantage to doing this. Furthermore, the government itself was talking about imposing a 10% rate. Well, by making the uniform 15%, you don't have to worry about breaking out the room fees and the food charges from the spa treatments. You don't have to worry about any of this. And let me tell you, the way that other countries implement this policy, if you go to Canada, for example, bit of advice, if you ever do go to Canada, and you get charged more than $100 in VAT, did you know that you can go and you can get this little form and you can fill it in, send it out to the government, and they will rebate your tax to you on your hotel accommodations and on many of the things that you may have shipped home. So, you know, if we're really talking about disadvantaging, I would argue that this current structure is disadvantageous to the hotel sector. And furthermore, if you have them charge it, then they will be, of course, able to get all of the credits that you would have standard from from the inputs. And the experience which we find throughout the world when you do implement that is probably on the very first or second or third or fourth day, you'll see the price. The price wouldn't have changed. You'll just see this 15%. Then what will happen is, over the next month to 2 months, you'll start to see the base price go down, so there's some adjustment. Part of the reason is all those businesses had to pay for all of those duties up front. They still are part of their cost structure. So you aren't likely to see an immediate impact on the prices. It will be more gradual. You'll see that immediate 15%. It will start to gradually come back down. And after 2 or 3 months, then you'll probably have the proper adjustment. But think about all of those small businesses under the current destination principle who actually have to carry the cost of the tax. Mr. Rao said that there is actually no cost, essentially, for the VAT to the business, and that's not entirely true. Number one, you have a cost when you go and you make the payment. And of course you're going to be able to clean it back, but how many of you would ever take me up on this offer? How many of you ever saw an old cartoon called Popeye the Sailor Man? And do you remember the man named Wimpy? I will gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today. Now, how many of you will take the Wimpy challenge? How many of you are willing to lend him the money today for him to be paying you exactly the same amount next Tuesday? Or how about, if we talk about this same principle, how many of you are willing to loan a friend $100 and they will pay you back $100 in 10 years' time? I hear chuckling. This is exactly what the government is suggesting. Granted, it's only 1 month, but this is exactly what the government is saying. It does not cost anything. You know, I think that all of us can see quite plainly that it does cost. You would rather have $100 in your pocket today than $100 in a month. And if we look at the fact that many businesses and Bahamians are paying fairly high interest rates, compare the interest rates that you pay on your credit cards, on your mortgages, to those in the United States. You supposedly are getting, why are you currently having a fixed exchange rate if you aren't going to be able to access the same capital markets? It's clear that you aren't. It's clear that the costs of capital are higher in the Bahamas than they are in the United States, is it not? Based upon the amount that you must borrow money at? Well, to my mind, that's a cost. Under the origin principle, I would not be paying it up front. I will, however, still get to take a credit for that cost when I go to the VAT. So when I collect my 15%, supposing that 1/3 of my cost was an import, I will then produce my sales receipt and I will say, but 1/3 of my cost was imported. Imports are exempt. I'm only charged on the value added within the country. So I'm only going to have to remit 10%. Now, all of a sudden, I'm actually ahead based on that. Now I can actually reduce the price. And I'll have to because everybody will start seeing that. Not only am I getting lower customs duty, but in fact, because I will not have to pay it on my imported goods, I'll be better off. And finally, when it comes to the issue of your manufacturers, this is a superior method. Because many of them, granted, will be bringing in capital goods. They may be doing it under a zero-rated regime. They may be doing it under a regime in which they do not have to pay duties. But to the extent that they are not zero rated, to the extent that they're dealing with inputs into the process, again, they will not have to put this money up front. And remember, if at the end of the day, that a business that has a loss, let's say they have a fire, or they have some other catastrophe, which meant that there may be spoilage, if you go under the so-called destination principle, which is what the government is proposing, you're going to be paying that tax and you're going to be eating it. And if the business is eating the costs, guess what's going to happen to the prices? At the consumer level, they're going to rise. So do you understand why at least it should be considered for this? I will leave you though with the one caveat, the one drawback to the origin-based system. And that will require a very strong central revenue agency to be able to make sure that the actual prices claimed by businesses are accurate. Because part of the problem is, obviously if I'm importing from a third party, I know what the price is, but a lot of imports may be within a country, within a company itself. And so if they are bringing in a good and they say, oh, this watch, I bought it from my manufacturer, we manufactured ourselves. It cost us $25 to manufacture it. And by the way, we're going to sell it here in the Bahamas for $25. Therefore, we don't have to remit anything. You see the problem here? You'll have to go based upon what we call a third-party transaction. You'll have to see what they actually are charging elsewhere and make those comparisons and hold them accountable and have stiff penalties if people try to cheat. Because the object is not to allow businesses to gouge the public. The object is to have a tax system that is fair, equitable, and efficient, and thus it's going to be able to be a boon to the Bahamian economy and not a drag on it, such as what happens with massive customs duties. Thank you very much. Ready to answer questions?
Do we have any questions for Professor? I'm going to be safe and say Professor. Any questions? Based on his opinion of what we're about to venture into in a few months.
What is your view on how a public? What is your view on how a public education program should be implemented, and how important is this in this kind of process?
Well, I think it's incredibly important. For example, let me just I want to go back to the notion here about this origin versus destination principle. I didn't point out this is actually going to be revenue neutral for the government because your imports are about 20% of the economy and your tourism sector is about 60%. So roughly speaking, trading off an extra 5% extra on the tourism sector is going to offset the 15% reduction in the import side. But if you don't explain things in a way that people can understand, they're not going to buy it. And if they don't buy it, then you're going to have poor implementation, you're going to have poor compliance. You're also going to have a lot of people who are going to be very upset regardless of what the outcome is. They won't see it. And so the first thing I would probably try to do is start by looking at the examples that we have, the bountiful examples that we have throughout the world, to help people to understand that it's not going to be so bad. I also happen to think that the government should consider a modest amount of money to go to the very poor in the form, actually everyone technically is the way you're going to do it, but it's going to help mostly the poor, to help offset some of these costs. So that if you sit there and just simply tell people it's going to be okay, it isn't nearly as effective as them seeing the physical reality that they are not going to be harmed. And the other thing that you're going to have to do is you're going to have a massive public education campaign, not just for the citizens and consumers, but also the businesses, to inform them that you intend to stand behind your price gouging mechanisms. You tend to actually step up enforcement in the weeks coming up to the implementation and the months following. Because again, if you don't have everybody on board with this, then there's going to be massive possibilities of price gouging, especially I would argue this is going to be true in places like the Family Islands where there's less competition than here in Nassau. In Nassau, it's going to be very difficult, I think, for a business to do